Good evening, everyone. Welcome back, fellow explorers, to this space we've built together, a place where the darkness is not something to fear, but something to lean into, something to understand, and something to sit with long after the lights go out. Tonight we are going down, deep down, into the forgotten hallways, the broken staircases, the rooms that time sealed shut and never reopened, into the places where the walls still hold memories, where the air is thick with something that science cannot always name, and where the silence is never quite as empty as it first appears. Get yourself comfortable right now. Pull a blanket around you. Pour yourself something warm, because what you are about to hear is not fiction. These are real accounts, shared by real people who walked into real places and came out changed, some of them shaken, some of them speechless, and some of them still carrying what they found there years and years later. There is something magnetic about abandoned places, isn't there? Something in the human heart that cannot walk past a broken window without wondering what happened behind it. Cannot pass a rusted gate without imagining who last pushed it open. Cannot stand in a crumbling hallway without feeling, just for a moment, like the echoes of former lives are pressing against the walls, trying to be remembered. That curiosity, that pull toward the forgotten, it speaks to something ancient in us. A need to bear witness. A need to say this place existed, these people lived here, what happened here matters. And sometimes the places themselves seem to agree. Sometimes they answer back. Tonight we have a collection of stories, experiences from real people who ventured into the unknown and discovered that not all abandoned places are truly empty. That sometimes whatever was left behind has not finished with the living just yet. So for now, get comfortable, settle in, and let the darkness take control. If this is your first time joining us here, welcome to the family. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story, because trust me, you are going to want to be here for what comes next. Story 1, The Laughter in the Manor. Some years ago, not so long that the memory has blurred, but long enough that the edges of it have taken on that particular quality that only genuinely strange experiences possess. A person went on what was supposed to be a simple camping trip with their partner and a close friend. Nothing extraordinary, just a few days away from the ordinary world, out in the open beneath the sky. But their friend, who had a history of appreciating the unusual, made a suggestion before they set up camp. A detour, he called it. A brief one. There was a place not far from where they planned to stay, a large abandoned manor that he had visited before and thought was worth seeing, especially for someone who loved photography as much as this person did. So they agreed, and they went. The manor stood alone. That is the thing that strikes you first about truly abandoned places in open countryside, the aloneness of them. There were no neighboring buildings pressing in close, no other structures to create the illusion of company. Only a single small residential house was visible at all, sitting roughly a kilometer away, barely noticeable even when you knew where to look. Beyond that, open fields, flat, unbroken, stretching away in every direction like the land itself had exhaled and gone still. The building had that quality that certain abandoned structures possess, the sense that it had stopped being a home long before anyone physically left it, long before the last key was turned in the last lock. As though the life had simply drained away slowly over years, leaving behind only the structure itself. Tall, hollow windows gaping like open mouths, shattered glass scattered across the floors inside, and an atmosphere so heavy and cold that the air seemed to drop in temperature the moment you stepped near the entrance. Not because of weather, not because of drafts, just because of what the place was. Because of their dog, their friend decided to walk the perimeter outside rather than venture in. The broken glass made the interior dangerous for the animal, and so the person and their partner went inside alone. Every step on those floors announced itself. The creak of old wood underfoot, the soft lift of dust stirred by movement. The way light came through the broken windows at strange angles, illuminating the floating particles in the air like tiny suspended worlds. They made their way toward the staircase and climbed, letting curiosity lead them upward. And that was when it happened, or rather, that was when the first thing happened. The moment they reached the upper floor, something changed. A feeling descended that had no easy name. Not fear exactly, though. Fear lived somewhere inside it, more like a heaviness, a pressure, a sense of accumulated sorrow so dense it had soaked into the walls and the floors and the air of this one particular part of the building. There was one room that was worse than the others. The person could feel it before they even reached the doorway. Standing at the threshold, they described it as a deeply uncomfortable sensation, not dramatic, not the sharp spike of terror, but something quieter and somehow worse for its quietness. A sadness that felt ancient and unresolved, pressing outward from the room like heat from an old fire that should have gone cold long ago. And connected to that feeling, inexplicably, without any logical reason, was the sense of children. The imprint of young lives on this particular space. Something that could not be explained, only felt. They told their partner they didn't like the room. That something felt wrong in it. And they went back downstairs, leaving their partner to continue exploring the upper floor alone for a few more minutes before he came down to join them. They stood together in the lower part of the building, in the quiet. And then it happened. A burst of sound swept past them, not from outside, not from upstairs, but right there beside them. A rush of energy like a current of air carrying sound within it. And within that sound, unmistakable, crystalline, absolutely clear. Children laughing. Not faintly, not as a distant or muffled noise filtered through walls. Right there, right next to them. As though invisible children had just run past in a breathless, joyful game, sweeping by so close that the laughter seemed to brush against them as it passed. Both of them froze. The person, who tends naturally toward wondering about such things, needed to be certain they had not imagined it alone. They asked quietly, almost in a whisper, "Did you hear that too?" Their partner, who is not prone to imagination of this kind, did not pause, did not hesitate, did not offer an alternative interpretation. "That was children," he said. They called out immediately to their friend outside. Was anyone else around? Were there kids nearby? The friend called back that there was a car driving around the courtyard area outside. And they grabbed onto that, both of them. They seized that explanation with the particular kind of relief that people feel when there is a rational option available, however unlikely. Maybe the laughter had come from outside. Maybe the sound had traveled in through the broken windows and bounced strangely through the empty, hollow chambers of that old place. Maybe the acoustics had done something unexpected with a perfectly ordinary noise from perfectly ordinary people outside. They knew it didn't quite fit. They knew on some level that it wasn't right. But it was enough for now. Enough to keep moving, enough to get through the rest of the visit, enough to pack up their things and head to the campsite and set up the tent in the fading light. It wasn't until later, lying in the tent in the dark in the woods, listening to the soft sounds of the night and trying to fall asleep, that the truth arrived. A cold wave of realization. They turned to their partner in the dark and said, barely above a whisper, "We talked to the people in the car. We spoke with them before we went in. There were no children with them." It had been a young woman learning to drive. Just a young woman and her instructor using the empty, traffic-free space of the courtyard to practice. No children, no families, no one else at all. No explanation. Their partner, the rational one, the unspiritual one, the man who does not believe in such things, lay in the dark for a moment after hearing this. And then he said, quietly and with absolute certainty, "I'm never going back, not unless it's to burn the place down." He meant it as a joke. He said it with just enough humor in his voice to keep it light. But underneath the humor was something real, something unsettled. The strange and unsettling footnote to all of this is that the manor did, in fact, burn down later. Completely destroyed, and the fire is believed to have started in the very section of the building where they had heard the laughter. Investigators suspected arson, a human cause, not a supernatural one. But the coincidence has a weight to it that does not sit easily. Over time, the person tried to find other accounts of strange experiences connected to the manor. They found no specific detailed stories, but they found something that felt meaningful in its own way. They found numerous passing references describing the place as unsettling, unpleasant, deeply uncomfortable to be in, and widely rumored to be haunted by those who knew of it. And there was one more thing. A video surfaced, recorded by someone who had explored the manor years before the fire. The person watched it with growing unease. The explorer moved through the building, filming as they went, and then, at almost the exact spot where the laughter had been heard, at almost the precise location of that staircase, the filming stopped. The camera was turned off, as though something about that particular location had made the person filming simply stop, turn away, and decide that some things were better left unrecorded. This memory lives on, It does not fade with time. It simply settles deeper, becomes more permanent, takes up more lasting residence in the mind. And perhaps that is the most honest thing about truly strange experiences: they do not leave. If any of you have ever walked into a place and felt something like that, a heaviness, a presence, something you couldn't explain, write it in the comments below. I know many of you have had moments like this, and I would love to hear your stories. Story 2, the Northville Asylum, the third and final run. There is an abandoned psychiatric institution outside of Northville, Michigan, and the person who tells this story broke into it 3 separate times. This is the story of the third time, the last time, the time they never went back after. The first 2 visits had been something closer to fascinating than frightening, the kind of exploration that feels like stepping through a door in time and finding yourself standing in a world that was carefully preserved in its abandonment. The first time, they stumbled onto a group of high school kids who scattered into pale, wide-eyed panic when they appeared from the shadows without warning. The second time, they encountered a group of relaxed, generous Vietnam veterans who were utterly unbothered by the surroundings and took it upon themselves to provide what can only be described as the most unexpected and memorable impromptu guided tour imaginable: relaxed, unhurried, genuinely knowledgeable about the place, pointing out details that ordinary visitors would have walked past without seeing. The complex itself was enormous, a sprawling, interconnected network of buildings linked by underground tunnels running beneath the grounds. There was a morgue, rusted gurneys still present, the cold metal carrying the memory of what they had once held. There were filing cabinets filled with patient records from decades past, the 1950s and beyond, personal documents left sitting in drawers as though someone had stepped out briefly and simply never returned. But the third visit was different, darker in ways that went beyond the physical darkness of the building. 3 people, 2 flashlights between them, both unreliable. They had already worked their way through significant sections of the asylum, the derelict wards with their wallpaper hanging in long, curling strips, the floors scattered with the detritus of abandonment, the rooms that held nothing left but atmosphere. That night they pushed toward the main building, and the main building was something else entirely. 18 stories, towering against the flat Michigan sky like a monument to something that no one was entirely sure how to name. From the top of that structure on a clear night, you could see for miles in every direction empty fields, crumbling industrial remnants, and on the horizon, the distant smudged glow of Detroit bleeding light upward into the dark sky. They were making their way up through the interior stairwells, their flashlight beams moving across walls covered in graffiti, tags from local groups marking their presence, crude drawings scratched directly into the plaster, eyes and open mouths captured in rough, urgent strokes by hands that had passed through this place long before tonight. And then the woman in their group stopped moving. She froze mid-step. Her eyes went wide. She told them to wait. "I hear footsteps," she whispered. The words landed in the heavy silence of the building with enormous weight. One of them tried to dismiss it, suggested it was simply the echo of their own movement bouncing back from the walls. But the other 2 shushed him immediately, firmly, without argument, and made him be quiet and truly listen. And there it was. Clear, unmistakable, deliberate. A slow, rhythmic sound drifting down from somewhere above them. A thud, then a scrape, then a thud again. Footsteps, unhurried, methodical, not rushing, not stumbling, the footsteps of someone or something moving steadily across the floor of the top level of an 18-story abandoned psychiatric institution at 2 o'clock in the morning. The building had a narrow footprint. Whoever, whatever, was making that sound was close. 1, maybe 2 landings above them at the most. Close enough that the vibration of each step seemed to travel faintly through the metal railing beneath their gripping hands. They huddled on the stairs in the trembling beam of their flashlights and debated in urgent whispers. What to do? Go up and investigate, go back the way they came, get out of the building entirely. One of the group, the boldest one, though perhaps not the most careful thinker at that particular moment, insisted it must be another explorer. Someone else doing the same thing they were doing, just in the same building on the same night. He wanted to go up and make contact. Maybe make a new friend, he said, like the veterans the second time. The response to this was firm and immediate. This was not the second time. This was 2 in the morning at the top of a gutted, decaying psychiatric institution, and whatever was up there moving through the dark was doing so alone and in no apparent hurry. This was not a moment for friendly introductions. The argument didn't land. The bold one began moving upward anyway, hand on the railing, grinning in the beam of a shaking flashlight. And that was the moment when the decision was made for everyone. One of them turned and ran. Not a careful, considered retreat. A full, committed sprint down the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time, knees jarring with every landing, flashlight beam swinging wildly against the graffiti-covered walls. And after a moment, mercifully, the others followed. They poured out through the exit at the bottom of the building and burst into the night air of the courtyard. And found themselves lit up by headlights. A police cruiser rolling slow patrol, its spotlight catching them perfectly, pinning them where they stood like animals frozen in open ground. What followed was a chaotic sprint through the sprawl of outbuildings and overgrown lots surrounding the asylum. 3 people diving behind dumpsters, threading through gaps in chain-link fencing, doubling back through overgrown sections, hearts hammering so hard the sound of it seemed to fill the air, until they finally put enough distance and enough obstacles between themselves and the cruiser, regrouped several blocks away, and stood bent over in the night air, gulping breath, soaked through with sweat. They never went back to the Northville Asylum. Not after the footsteps, not after the cops, and if anyone had suggested going back, the answer would have been immediate and unanimous and final. Story 3, The Man in the Bathroom. A few months ago, a group of 3 friends decided to explore an abandoned hotel that they had been watching for some time. The place had been empty for years, boarded doors, shattered windows, the kind of slow, creeping overgrowth that takes hold of neglected properties and gradually begins to pull them back into the earth. They got inside through a broken window on the ground floor, and for the first hour or so, everything felt relatively normal for this kind of exploration. Empty hallways, stripped rooms, the particular kind of trashed and echoing quiet that abandoned buildings carry. They joked around. They took photographs. They did what you do in a place like this when the atmosphere hasn't yet declared itself. But they made a mistake that they knew, even as they were making it, was a mistake. They got loud, laughing, talking at full volume, relaxed enough to forget where they were and what kind of place this was. In a building where anyone could theoretically be present, sheltering, hiding, existing in ways that would not make an encounter welcome, they let their guard down entirely. Eventually, they made their way into a long corridor lined with rooms on both sides. Natural light came through the broken windows at the far end of the hall itself, but the individual rooms were entirely dark. No light reached them. One of the 3 walked a bit ahead of the others. They had the main flashlight, and the other 2 had fallen behind, still laughing about something. The person walked into one of the dark rooms to look around, and something drew them toward the bathroom at the back of the room. Perhaps instinct, perhaps simple curiosity. They raised their flashlight and swept the beam across the small space. And stopped breathing. Crouched down in the corner of the bathroom was a man. For 2 or 3 long, strange seconds, the brain refused to process what the eyes were clearly reporting. The person simply stared, the flashlight beam holding steady on the figure in the corner, trying to determine whether what they were seeing was real, whether this was a trick of shadow and tired eyes. Then the man snapped his head up and looked directly at them, and he yelled, loud, sharp, genuinely angry. "What are you doing?" There was no time for an answer. He was on his feet and moving before the last word had finished leaving his mouth, coming forward with the purposeful, furious energy of someone who had no intention of having a conversation. The person bolted, out of the bathroom, out of the room, shouting a single word to their friends as they ran. "Run!" All 3 of them sprinted down the hallway, and the footsteps behind them confirmed that this was not a situation that was going to resolve itself quietly. The man was chasing them, not hesitating, not calling after them, actively running, keeping pace. Near the far end of the hallway, one of the 3 went down hard, hit the floor mid-sprint, full weight. The other 2 reached back without breaking stride, grabbed them, yanked them upright, and kept running without pausing for a breath. There was no room for pausing. There was only the exit, the window they had come through, and the absolute necessity of reaching it before the footsteps behind them got any closer. They went through that window the way they had entered, except with none of the careful negotiation of glass and broken frame that had characterized the entry. They went through fast, and they didn't stop on the other side. They ran until the hotel was well behind them and the distance had finally stretched to something that felt like safety. And then they stopped, looked at each other, and started laughing. The involuntary, slightly unhinged laughter of people who have just been genuinely frightened and who have no other immediate way to process the adrenaline still flooding their systems. It was the only time in all their experiences with urban exploration that they had encountered another human being who responded with that kind of aggression. And while in hindsight there were elements of the absurd to it, the frantic running, the tripped friend, the scramble through the window, in the moment, as it was happening, it was one of the most genuinely terrifying experiences they had ever had. And honestly, a reminder that in abandoned places, the people you might encounter are sometimes more frightening than anything else those walls could offer. Story 4, The Footsteps on the Stair. This story comes from someone who grew up in a genuinely small, genuinely remote community, the kind of place that most people, when asked to imagine the middle of nowhere, would immediately picture. A cluster of buildings. A small town built around a school. Fields stretching away in every direction, flat and open and mostly quiet. To get to school from home was a 10-minute walk, and that walk led through an abandoned field where the grass had grown so tall over so many years that it had become its own landscape, a waist-high sea of rough green that moved in the wind and obscured everything within it. At the far end of the field stood a farmhouse. Old wooden alone. A lone sentinel, one person described it, watching over fields that nobody tended anymore. In all the years of walking past it, every school day, morning and afternoon, through every season, there had never been a light visible in any window, not once. No movement, no sign of occupancy. No one in the town seemed to particularly mention it or think about it. It was simply there. It had always been there. It would presumably always be there. But it had lodged itself in the back of one young mind and stayed there, quietly generating questions that never quite went away. Who had lived there? What had they left behind when they left? And perhaps the most compelling question of all, why had they left? When this person turned 17, on a Saturday afternoon in the height of summer with friends gathered and nothing particular to occupy them, the memory of the farmhouse surfaced. They had just set down a Game Boy controller after a lost round of a video game and looked out the window at the open fields, and there it was, the thought of that house, sitting at the end of its overgrown approach, waiting, as it had always been waiting. They proposed an expedition. Several of the friends had never even been to that end of town and had no particular mental image of the house. A few had seen it from a distance. Most were game for the adventure. And so, after roughly half an hour of preparation, 6 of them set out. 8 minutes later, they were there. Figuring out how to actually approach the house proved more complicated than expected. A circuit of the property in the car revealed what appeared to be a former entrance road, but nature had reclaimed it so thoroughly, trees growing across it, vegetation filling every space, that driving through was completely impossible. The road had been out of use long enough that the earth had largely forgotten it existed. They parked, got out, and walked. The foliage was extraordinary, waist-high at minimum, in places higher, rough, and scratchy against any exposed skin. All 6 of them ran through it with their arms raised above their heads to avoid the scraping contact, which created a sight that was, by any honest assessment, fairly ridiculous. 6 teenagers charging through tall grass with their hands in the air, moving toward a weathered farmhouse at the end of an overgrown field on a summer Saturday. They reached the house and stood looking up at it. No padlocks, no chains, no obvious impediment. The porch was accessible, and after years of wondering, of passing this place thousands of times and never doing anything but wondering, the moment had finally arrived. The door was unlocked. It swung open, and what lay beyond it was nothing. A bare room, wood floors, empty walls. The people who had once lived in this place had, when they finally left, taken absolutely everything with them. Every piece of furniture, every object, every trace of the texture of daily life. All that remained was the shell of the house itself. Downstairs offered the same story in every room. An old kitchen stripped bare. A broken chair lying abandoned on the floor of one room like an afterthought. Left behind perhaps because it was already broken and therefore not worth the effort of removing. The friends looked around with the particular mild disappointment of people who had expected more. The staircase groaned magnificently underfoot as the person climbed it. They had heard the advice somewhere about stairs in old buildings. Step toward the corners rather than the center. where the wood is more likely to be structurally sound. And so they made their way up in a series of corner-to-corner steps, careful and slow, until they reached the upper landing. 3 rooms up here, an upper-floor bathroom. Pink curtains still hanging in one window, an unexpected detail, a surviving splash of color in an otherwise emptied space. Some old scratch marks near a doorway where people had once stood to have their heights measured and marked with small notations. That was it. That was all that remained of whoever had lived here. Disappointment settled in gently. The friends came tumbling up the stairs behind, laughing and declaring the place a bit disappointing, which it was. And then one of them looked up. Above the stairwell, partially concealed, was a hatch. An attic. The mood shifted immediately. The taller friend was recruited to push the hatch open. It swung up into darkness, a darkness that smelled of age and sealed air and the accumulated decades of a sealed space, and everyone peered upward into it. Most of them expressed reasonable reservations about what might be living up there. Rats were mentioned. General unknowns were cited. But the person who had carried this curiosity for years decided, without a great deal of deliberation, that they were going up. They positioned their foot at the top of the banister, used the leverage to push themselves up, and after a few moments of scrambling negotiation of the hatch opening, found themselves inside the attic with a torch, a bulky, old-fashioned thing, since this was before phones came equipped with flashlights, switched on, and casting its beam around the space. And suddenly, everything looked different. The attic was not empty. Boxes, multiple boxes, objects covered with sheets, the accumulated things of a life or lives that had been too large, too bulky, or too unimportant to bother carrying down the stairs on the day of leaving. These things had been sealed up here, left behind in the dark, and had sat untouched, for how long it was impossible to know. They called down to their friends, "There's stuff up here." One by one, all 6 of them made their way through the hatch. They spread out and began looking through the boxes in the cone of torchlight. Papers that none of them could make much sense of and had no particular interest in. A few metal objects, springs, fixtures, miscellaneous hardware. An old bed frame. Random items that had accumulated in this space the way things accumulate in attic spaces everywhere, over the years, becoming gradually more anonymous and less connected to anyone's daily life. And then family photographs. Albums of them, small family, 3 people. A mother, a father, a daughter of perhaps 12 years old. The clothing dated to roughly the 1940s. The faces looked out from the photographs with the particular slightly formal, slightly unsmiling expression that people often wore for photographs in that era. A family in a house in the middle of fields, captured in monochrome in the decade after a world war. This was all that was left of them here in this attic. Their things, their photographs, their height marks on the doorframe downstairs. The friends talked about it briefly, put things back, decided to head down and leave. And that was when the front door slammed shut downstairs. The sound traveled through the whole house, sharp, definitive, announcing itself with the particular confidence of something physical and real. They hadn't even realized they'd left the front door open. They'd been so absorbed in the attic that the detail had slipped past all. 6 of them. And then came the second sound. Heavy footsteps. Beginning at the bottom of the staircase. Rising, deliberate, slow, 1 step at a time with a steadiness that carried a particular kind of weight, not rushing, not uncertain, but absolutely purposeful. Moving upward through the house, step by step, the sound reverberating throughout the entire structure so that all 6 people in the attic could hear it clearly, could count each step, could feel the reality of it pressing in from below. The person nearest the hatch, the one who had been so eager to explore, looked down through the opening as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. And saw nothing. The top of the landing was visible from that angle. The last 2 steps were visible, and there was no one there. No boots, no legs, no person cresting the staircase at the end of that deliberate climb. The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs and simply ceased, as though whoever had climbed them had arrived and was simply standing there, present without being visible. When they told the others they hadn't seen anyone, the friends were skeptical, convinced this was a scare tactic. One of them climbed down and shouted into the house, "Who's there?" Silence. Empty rooms, no one. One of the group said quietly that perhaps by going through the things in the attic, they had disturbed whatever presence was resting in this house. And that was enough. All six of them agreed, without significant debate, without arguing, without trying to rationalize, that it was time to leave. They left. 2 hours, 6 people, 6 witnesses to the sound of footsteps that had no source. Footsteps that all of them heard, clearly and simultaneously, in a house that logic said was empty. In a building that showed no sign of having been visited by anyone in a very long time. You cannot manufacture footsteps. You cannot collectively hallucinate the specific, physical, sequential sound of boots climbing old wooden stairs. It happened. All six of them know it happened, and none of them have a satisfying explanation for it, then or now. Like this video if this story gave you chills, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Some stories need to be heard. Story 5, The House That Watched Back. This account happened in 2021, in a small village with more abandoned houses than activities to fill an afternoon. A group of friends looking for somewhere to spend time. Without being observed or interrupted, somewhere that was theirs for a few hours, decided that one of the village's many abandoned structures might serve the purpose. They had already explored 2 without incident when they noticed a third house they had not previously paid attention to. Curiosity, as it tends to do, made the decision for them. The house was locked. This was normal for abandoned properties, often locked more by habit and by whoever last left than by any active effort at security. They had brought a tool that could deal with most standard locks and used it, only to discover that the lock was not the only thing holding the door closed. There was a chair wedged against the inside of the door, blocking it deliberately from the inside. The window on the door was broken to investigate, and there it was, a chair placed with unmistakable intention against the door from the interior of a house that was supposed to be empty. Strange, unsettling even, but they climbed in anyway. The inside of the house was surprising in a different direction than expected. It was clean, tidier than any abandoned building they had previously entered. Everything sat in its place with an orderliness that felt almost deliberate, except for one room where clothing was strewn in every direction across the floor, scattered with an energy that contrasted sharply with the neatness elsewhere. They noted it and moved on to the bedroom. The bedroom door was locked. They opened it. About 10 to 15 minutes into their time in the bedroom, with no wind present, no exterior disturbance of any kind, all windows and doors in the house sealed, the bedroom door slammed shut behind them. They tried to open it. It had relocked itself. The lock that they had just broken to enter had somehow re-engaged with nothing to explain how. Eventually, they got it open, but the experience left them shaken in a way that the initial chair against the door had not quite managed. And then, and this is the part that, looking back, feels most representative of the particular kind of recklessness that youth can generate, they decided to carve their names into the wall. Not just visit and leave, but mark the space as having been visited. Make their presence permanent in the walls of this strange, quiet house that had already demonstrated it did not entirely welcome them. They also took things: knives, a small hammer, church candles, gas masks. Various other items that caught their attention and seemed worth keeping. Further exploration revealed another locked door down a short hallway. They forced it open at the cost of the small hammer which broke in the process. Beyond it, another exit and a large room leading down to the basement. In the kitchen, they found something that stopped them more than the slammed door had. Another bed, not unusual in itself in a house with odd arrangements, but next to it, a mirror, sitting on a table, positioned precisely facing another mirror mounted on the opposite wall. 2 mirrors placed to reflect each other in that infinite regress of reflection that, in certain traditions, is associated with purposes that are not easily named in daylight. The feeling that emanated from that arrangement was immediate and specific, not just unease, but something that suggested the setup was not accidental, that it had been placed this way with intent. They went to the basement. The moment all 3 of them stepped through the basement door, a headache hit, not gradually, not as a slow pressure building, but immediately, as though something in the air of that space simply did not agree with human nervous systems. One of the friends came close to fainting. They went back upstairs quickly, gathered near the exit door, and waited for the feeling to pass. After a while, they decided to leave and regroup. They had already started calling the house their hangout spot, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that it had unnerved them in multiple ways. Young people have a peculiar relationship with the things that frighten them. The next day, two of them returned with cameras. In the hallway, one of them, Jane, took a photograph of herself in the mirror. Standard, casual, the kind of photograph you take in a mirror without thinking. When they looked at the image afterward, her face was wrong. Her features had taken on a quality that suggested bone more than skin, her eyes appearing as blank white ovals in the photograph when they had been entirely normal in person. And behind her, visible in the mirror's reflection, were small white circles, rounded, hovering, that had no obvious physical explanation. Then Delina asked to have her photograph taken. Most came out normally, but one of them captured something that could not be accounted for, a white shape visible beside her, positioned in a way that could not have been a reflection of the person taking the photograph, who was not wearing white and was standing at an angle where their image would not have appeared in the mirrors at all. It was not a light source. There was no flashlight in use, and the only window was behind the mirror. A photograph of the bedroom itself was also taken, strange only in the mess they had made of it themselves. On the third day, they brought a new friend, Mary, to see the house. They gathered primarily in the bedroom, which had the most light and felt the most comfortable of the available spaces. They rearranged things slightly, organized books and magazines on the shelves. Mary found old photographs of various places stored somewhere in the room, and using nails taken from the basement, hung some of them on the wall. None of them were thinking deeply about what any of this might mean. They were teenagers in an abandoned house, rearranging the furniture and decorating the walls. Then came the fourth day, the day that changed the shape of the whole experience. 2 o'clock in the morning, messages beginning to arrive in rapid succession. Jane's mother had woken from a nightmare, not a vague, uneasy dream, but a nightmare specific enough to describe in detail. A woman with skin white as snow, not quite looking alive, standing in the dream and speaking, telling Jane's mother that the girls had done something they should not have done, that they needed to return everything they had taken. The most significant detail, Jane's mother had no knowledge of what they had taken. They had not told any parents about the house, about the items, about any of it. She did not know they had taken anything, and yet the woman in her dream had spoken directly to this specific fact. Morning came. They went back. They placed everything back in its original location. They stood in the rooms of the house and apologized out loud, speaking to the air, saying the words that felt necessary regardless of whether they felt foolish for saying them. When they left and began walking away down the street toward the park, the person looked back at the house. In the attic window there was a figure, a white silhouette clearly and unmistakably the shape of a woman, standing, watching, present in the window of a house that was empty. After a moment, the figure turned and walked away into the interior darkness of the attic. From that day forward, whenever any of them passed that house, they greeted, "Good morning, good evening, have a good day." It has become a ritual, reflexive, continued to this day. They never told Mary about the photographs. They decided quietly and among themselves that there was no benefit in her knowing. Some things once shared cannot be unshared. Whether the house was truly haunted remains, in the technical sense, uncertain. Whether the experience left a permanent mark on every person who walked through that door, that is not uncertain at all. Story 6, The Prison That Remembered. There is an abandoned prison in a sizable town near a major city, the kind of place that is invisible to most of the people who live nearby simply because of how thoroughly it has been swallowed by its surroundings. Tucked away, screened by overgrowth, accessible only by a route that most people would never have reason to take. The narrator had grown up near enough to those railroad tracks to know them well, but had never known the prison existed until a friend who was deep into urban exploration pointed it out. A team of 3, first time doing anything like this for the narrator, some nerves, considerable excitement. Getting to the prison required parking in a cul-de-sac in a fairly new residential neighborhood and walking from there, past a ditch, across an area of flat, undeveloped land, through high grass that lined what had once been a dirt road and was now more suggestion than path. The only things marking the way forward were the trespassing signs and warning notices posted at intervals, which in hindsight should perhaps have been taken more seriously as a reason to turn around. They kept walking. The prison, when it finally revealed itself, was not a single dramatic structure, but a collection of components. An overgrown greenhouse structure near the entrance, guard towers still wrapped in old barbed wire, smaller buildings that had served various functions in the prison's operational life. They started with what appeared to have been classrooms. Inside the classroom building, stripped of every piece of furniture, the walls bore an old blackboard, and on that blackboard names. Just names, written in the plain, ordinary way that names get written on blackboards, students' names, prisoners' names, names of people who had once been present in this room in some capacity. The narrator stood and looked at those names and felt something move through them that they struggled to name. A recognition, maybe, a sudden awareness of the reality of lives lived in this place. Those had been real people. They were possibly dead now. Whatever they had experienced here had been real, and the names on the blackboard were the only thing left to mark their presence. The feeling that something was watching settled in from that moment, and never entirely left. The further they pushed into the prison grounds, the more they found small brick buildings with furniture tossed carelessly outside, drawers inside still containing documents with personal information, the detritus of whatever the prison's final days had looked like, and evidence of more recent visits, fast food wrappers, other traces of people who had come through within living memory. The narrator hoped these visitors had come for the same reason they had. Then one of the small buildings offered something different. A piece of broken tile on the floor, and beneath it peeking out an old document. The narrator picked it up, looked at it briefly, and put it back. Standard, unremarkable as far as it went. But when they stepped outside, something changed. They described it as a wave of feeling rather than a specific sensation, a heavy, dense melancholy that arrived suddenly and settled over them with a weight that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not felt something similar. Not threatening, not angry, nothing directed at them personally with any hostility. More like an emotion that belonged to the space itself, generated by whatever had happened here, still present and still trying to be known by anyone willing to stop and feel it. And there was something else within it, a quality that was harder to name, but that felt, to the narrator, like the presence was aware of being there and somehow approving of this visit, as long as everyone behaved with respect. As long as no one mocked the place or damaged what remained. Whatever lingered here, it seemed to want this story told, to want the history of this place acknowledged rather than allowed to be silently forgotten. The narrator said nothing to the friends, kept it internal, but became careful, watchful, aware of the presence in a way that made casual behavior feel dangerous. They eventually reached the main prison building. The entrance corridor was relatively plain, stripped, emptied, a few surviving sections of original wood paneling. Further in, a hallway, bearing an old government logo painted on the wall, an earlier version of something official, dating from decades prior. And gang graffiti, not local tags, but the marks of well-known American organizations, some from South America, in this remote, hidden place that most of the nearby city didn't even know existed. And then a pentagram, detailed, deliberate, drawn directly onto the wall, the kind of symbol that, in a place with this particular history, generates a specific and unpleasant kind of speculation. At the end of the hallway, a barred door, locked, old-fashioned, immovable. The urban explorer friend grabbed the bars and struck a joking pose for a photograph. And at that exact moment, from somewhere beyond the locked door, somewhere in the unreachable depths of the prison, an enormous crash. A huge pane of glass shattering, the sound bouncing through the sealed space and arriving through the bars with tremendous force. The protected feeling that had accompanied the narrator through the whole visit dropped away instantly. The sense of being shielded by some ambient goodwill disappeared. Not replaced by malice, not directed at any of them personally, but the peace was gone. The ease was gone. "Guys, let's just go. I don't feel safe anymore." They left. On the long walk back out through the grass and the dark, there was a persistent sensation, difficult to articulate, easy to feel, of being escorted. Of something or someone walking behind them, not threatening, just present, waiting for them to clear the property entirely. When the narrator reached the car and finally shared what they had experienced with their friends, the response was straightforward enthusiasm about old equipment and structural details. They hadn't felt anything unusual. For them, it had been an interesting historical site. For the narrator, it had been something considerably more loaded. That night, the narrator searched online. The prison's history was darker than anything they had imagined walking through its grounds. It had opened in 1909. The overwhelming majority of its prisoners had been African American, and the prison had operated under a system of convict leasing, a practice in which prisoners were essentially rented out to employers who could work them however they chose. Deaths from malnutrition and brutal treatment were not uncommon. There were graveyards. And in 2018, during routine federal work in the area, human bone was discovered that turned out to be the beginning of something terrible. Excavation revealed a burial ground containing 95 additional bodies, unmarked graves, mass burial sites for people who had died in and around this place and been buried without names, without markers, without acknowledgement. 95 people, hidden, forgotten, until 2018. That is what the narrator had felt when they picked up that document and stepped outside. That is what had pressed against them in the classroom with the names on the blackboard. That is what had walked with them to the car. If you want to know more about this place, look up the Central Unit, previously known as the Imperial State Prison Farm in Sugar Land, Texas. It is a history that deserves to be known. What do you think about this place? About the stories it holds? Write your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know what this made you feel. Story 7. The Scream in Little Flower Mansion. Two friends had built what they called an Herbex hobby, urban exploration, into a regular practice over several years. 20 missions over that time. Some brief and simple, some elaborate and hours long, some forgettable and some profoundly memorable. The kind of sustained practice that turns casual curiosity into genuine skill and transforms two ordinary people into reasonably capable navigators of abandoned spaces. On a quiet autumn morning in the middle of a weekday, they researched potential locations. The choice that day was the Little Flower Mansion, an antebellum structure with colonial architectural features, reportedly connected in some capacity to one of the early presidents of the country. 20 minutes by GPS. They parked several blocks away and approached. The property sat tucked behind an active nursing home, which required some navigation around the back entrance, through a gap in a chain-link fence just large enough for a person. The approach took them through what had once been the slave quarters, through a small hallway connecting to a dried-up fountain, and onward through the kitchen and pantry areas of the main structure. And then into the main corridor. 20-foot ceilings, some of the original furniture still present, still standing after more than a century. A wide, U-shaped staircase sweeping upward to the left, a basement door to the right. The scale and quality of what this place had once been was evident in every remaining detail, the proportions, the surviving craftsmanship, the ambition of the original construction. Whatever it had looked like in its prime, it had been genuinely magnificent. But more than 100 years of neglect had done their work. The ceiling had partially collapsed, and beneath it, fed by whatever moisture found its way in through the damage, a murky pool had spread across the floor, 50 feet in extent, still and dark, reflecting the broken ceiling above it. They climbed the staircase and moved through the upper floor, photographing what they found. Nothing overtly alarming. At the far end of the building, a prayer room notable for a marble altar that had remained in place through all the years of abandonment, and for evidence that someone had more recently been living here. A pipe, a PlayStation 2 controller, a sleeping bag, wrappers and containers from recent meals. Someone had been using the prayer room of an abandoned antebellum mansion as their shelter. They checked the front door, strongly boarded and bolted from the outside, impassable. They made their way back and down to the basement. The basement was less atmospheric than they had anticipated. Low ceiling, exposed pipes, clearly unsuitable for habitation or for whatever their imagination had been assembling in preparation for it. After more than an hour of exploration, they decided to wrap up and head out. Throughout the entire time inside, the building had been profoundly still. The only sounds had been the occasional drip of water from the damaged ceiling above and the sporadic sound of wind moving through gaps in the structure. Peaceful almost, in the particular way that long-abandoned places can be peaceful when they've settled into their emptiness. And then from somewhere upstairs, a scream. A woman's scream. Blood-curdling is the word used. Not ambiguous, not atmospheric, not a sound that required interpretation. A clear, unmistakable human voice raised in something that sounded like genuine terror or anguish, coming from the upper floor of a building that had just been fully explored and found to contain, as far as they knew, only one person's abandoned living space. They ran, not investigated, not called out to ask if anyone needed help. ran in the instinctive, total, uncomplicated way that humans run when the primitive brain takes over and removes all consideration from the process. They circled the property at speed, and in doing so discovered a surveillance camera positioned on the driveway, something they had missed entirely on the way in. Whether the scream had been the voice of a living person, a squatter in some part of the building they had not reached, or whether it had been something else, they could not say with certainty. They did not go back to find out. Story 8, The Figure on the Porch. This narrator grew up in farming country. The kind of vast, flat, endlessly open landscape where the horizon seems to go on forever, and the farmhouses that appear every few miles feel like they belong to the land itself, as much as to any human occupant. There was one farmhouse in particular, about 35 miles out from town, in the middle of land that was as empty as land gets. It had a reputation for being a place you didn't go at night. The kind of reputation that builds slowly in a community over years, fed by no specific incident that anyone could name, just a collective agreement that something about that place was not right. A group of 5 friends and a stepbrother decided one evening to drive out and see it. The 3 with the most apprehension, Jake, Justin, and Matt, stationed themselves in the car when they arrived, claiming lookout duty, which was in truth simply the position that allowed them to participate in the adventure without actually going inside. The narrator, the stepbrother, and their best friend found a broken lower window and climbed through into the interior. Inside was the standard inventory of long-abandoned spaces, crushed cans, debris, evidence of a fire at some point in the building's history, blackened walls, and heat-warped objects. Nothing that felt immediately threatening, just the familiar grimness of a neglected place. Then the narrator's phone buzzed. Justin calling from the car, his voice carrying the particular tension of someone trying to sound casual while not feeling it at all. "Where are you guys right now?" "In the house, back porch area." "All of you?" "Yeah." A pause. "Because someone is standing on the porch looking directly at our car." The initial assumption was that one of the 3 inside had come out through a door without the others noticing. The rapid back and forth of the phone call established this was not the case. All 3 were together inside, nowhere near any exterior door. They had entered through a side window and come through to the back of the house. None of them had gone out onto the porch. "Well, then there's someone on your porch." They ignored the warning and went to see for themselves, rounded the side of the house and came into the open front yard and looked. There was a figure on the porch, standing completely still. Human in shape, human in outline, human in scale, and yet clearly, distinctly wrong in the way that it occupied its space. The pale moonlight washed across everything in that flat, open landscape with a diffuse silver quality, and against that light every other surface and object in the yard was visible and understandable. The figure was darker than the darkness around it. Not simply dark, not simply unlit, darker than the unlit night, as though it were absorbing whatever light approached it and giving nothing back. A silhouette that defined itself not by light hitting it, but by the absence of light where it stood. No features, no face, no details, only the shape of a human presence and the absolute, complete, impossible absence of light within that shape. No one needed to be told twice. They ran, all 3 of them simultaneously, without discussion, at full speed back across the open ground to the car. And Jake had it moving before the doors were properly shut. Gravel spraying, tires finding purchase. The farmhouse and the figure on its porch falling away behind them as the car accelerated down the empty road. 10 minutes of silence. Then, an all-night diner, fluorescent light, coffee cups, and the deliberate work of processing what they had just seen. Everyone who had been in the car described the experience of looking at the figure and feeling it looking back. Justin and Matt said it felt like a threat, like something that was ready to act. Jake, the religious one in the group, said it felt demonic. The best friend, who was not given to emotional extremes, said it had hit him with a devastating sadness, immediate and overwhelming. The narrator and the stepbrother had read it differently, not as a threat, not as demonic, not as sad, but as an eviction. Like a very large, very certain presence communicating one single clear message: leave. They left. 2 weeks later, word reached them that the property had burned to the ground. Completely, nothing remained. No one had lived there, no explanation was offered. The figure on the porch, whatever it was, no longer has a porch to stand on. Story 9. Monkey Town. Every community has its legend. The story that gets passed down through the generations of teenagers who grow up in that place, told at sleepovers, whispered at lunch tables, dared in cars parked at the edge of wherever the story lives. For one narrator growing up in northern New England, that story was Monkey Town. The legend, a Christian retreat camp of some kind, reached by driving down a narrow road pressed between a funeral home and a cemetery before plunging down a steep hill into a perfect circle of old-fashioned houses arranged around a large white church in the center. The houses were said to be lit by flickering lanterns. The dare, simple, as the best dares always are. See how far down the hill you could drive before your nerve gave out and you turned the car around. In middle school, the narrator and friends had made it halfway a few times before laughing their way back to safety. Then came the year of having a driver's license and a beat-up Chevy Blazer and a friend from out of town, named Cale, who had never heard of Monkey Town, and therefore had absolutely no idea what he was agreeing to when they asked him if he wanted to see something freaky. They drove down that hill with the Halloween theme playing on the stereo, appropriate, perfectly atmospheric, and stayed in the car. The circle was extraordinary even from that distance. The weathered houses, the white church in the center, the single red light pulsing slowly at the top of the steeple like a slow mechanical heartbeat. Then movement. A man enormous in overalls coming across the ground toward the car at a full run, his face twisted with fury, something in his hand that may have been a bat or a pipe. There was no time to determine which. The Blazer was already reversing, tires screeching, accelerating back up the hill, both passengers screaming. This should have been enough. It was absolutely enough. It was more than enough for any reasonable assessment of the situation. The narrator was 17 and had something to prove. The next day, loaded into the Blazer with James driving. A full car, 5 passengers including 2 friends who shared the same name, which would have been funnier under less adrenaline-saturated circumstances. They went back. They made it roughly halfway around the circle. The screaming from the backseat began first, and when the narrator turned to look, the blood went cold in their veins. Not one man this time. 5 at minimum. Large men in overalls running, and at least 3 of them were visibly carrying weapons. They were bellowing, screaming at the car to stop. And they hit the vehicle with enough force to rock it on its suspension, yanking at the door handles, pounding on the glass, the entire car shaking under the impact of multiple bodies slamming into it. James behind the wheel had frozen, eyes wide, not moving, the car shaking around him and him not moving. The narrator was nearly on the floor of the passenger seat, yelling at him to drive. Drive, drive. He snapped out of it. Engine, acceleration, gravel, exit, Monkey Town shrinking in the rearview mirror. When the narrator got home, 2 police officers were waiting in the kitchen. One of the Monkey Town residents had called 911 and reported that the car had attempted to run people over. The narrator told the officers everything: the charging men, the weapons, the car being physically attacked, the shaking and pounding and screaming. The officers took notes with the expression of people who had heard this particular category of story before and were not particularly surprised by any element of it. No arrests, no charges, a firm recommendation to stay away from the area. To this day, the narrator wonders what is actually being protected there. What it is that compels the residents of that circle of houses to respond to curious teenagers with that particular ferocity. What kind of Christian retreat operates on the principle of armed men charging vehicles in the middle of the night? The answers, it seems, are not available to the curious from the outside. Story 10, The Light in the Basement. In the summer of 1988, a youth theater group was rehearsing and performing The Wizard of Oz, and their director had arranged for them to use the gymnasium and theater building at Westboro State Hospital. The hospital grounds were vast, the kind of institutional landscape that belongs to a different era of thinking about care and space and architecture. Enormous lawns, large brick buildings dating back to the 1870s, patient wards, administrative blocks, maintenance facilities, a crematorium, roads, and mature trees. Not grim in the way that the word asylum might suggest, but almost collegiate, full of the particular beauty that old New England brick and green lawn can produce when given sufficient space to breathe. By the 1980s, most of the buildings stood empty. The theater itself was rarely used, somewhat worn, but solid enough for their purposes. Theater rehearsals, particularly for large casts, involve a great deal of waiting. Scenes are worked with some participants while others sit idle, and idle teenagers in an extraordinary space will always, eventually, go exploring. They had already found the projection booth and the basement bowling alley, the latter particularly striking. A perfectly preserved domestic leisure space in the basement of a psychiatric hospital, when they found the tunnels. Concrete tunnels, running underground between the buildings of the campus, connecting the various structures through a network that was dark and unlit, and covered in the grime of years, but entirely intact and passable. The wire gates that were meant to prevent access from the tunnels into the buildings themselves posed limited obstacles to teenagers of sufficient motivation and physical flexibility. What lay beyond those gates was everything that such places always are, the full weight of institutional history made physical. Dirty green tile covering the walls, rows of metal lockers, wooden floors warped by decades of moisture and neglect with gaps through which you could look down into the rooms below, a hallway filled with old wheelchairs and hospital beds pushed together and abandoned as though someone had simply run out of space and left them where they stood. Offices, patient wards, bathing areas. Nurses' stations. Fascinating, and quietly terrifying in the way that places carrying the concentrated memory of human suffering often are. They were back for evening rehearsals, extra sessions added to the schedule as the performances approached, and during a free period, the narrator found themselves outside in the gathering dark with a couple of other cast members, wandering between the buildings adjacent to the theater. It was getting dark. The buildings were settling into their evening silences. The narrator happened to look toward the basement level of the building they had explored earlier, and saw something that made them stop mid-sentence. Light, visible through one of the basement windows, glowing faintly through the accumulated grime on the glass. Not a moving beam, not a flashlight being carried by someone passing through. A steady, static light, illuminating the basement room from within. In a building that was completely abandoned, with a basement that was difficult to access, contained nothing that anyone would have reason to access, and had shown every sign of being undisturbed for an extremely long time. The narrator interrupted the conversation and pointed it out. Look, there's a light in the basement. And in the time it took for all of them to turn their heads and look. The light went out. The building was still, dark, silent, no flashlight moving, no security guard visible anywhere, no sign of human presence whatsoever. Many of those old buildings no longer exist. They have been demolished over the years, or have simply collapsed under the weight of their own neglect. What remains now is memory, the memory of tunnels and green tile and rows of old hospital beds, of a summer spent in a remarkable and eerie place, and of a light in a basement that had no business being there and disappeared before it could be explained. The narrator has no explanation for it, never has. Some questions outlast the places that generate them. And that, dear friends, brings us to the end of tonight's journey. We have wandered through manor houses and psychiatric asylums, through farmhouses and forgotten prisons, through mansions whose ceilings have collapsed into pools and corridors where the darkness is darker than it has any right to be. We have heard the laughter of children who were not there. We have felt the footsteps of presences that left no footprints. We have seen figures made of darkness standing in places where no one should have been standing. And perhaps what connects all of these stories, what makes them worth telling and worth hearing, is not simply the fear. It is the curiosity, the unquenchable, deeply human need to know what is in the room beyond the closed door, what is at the top of the stairs, what the light in the basement means. We are drawn to these places not because we want to be frightened, but because we want to understand. Because somewhere in the broken walls and the sealed rooms and the atmosphere of the long abandoned, there are answers to questions that the living world doesn't always know how to ask. What do you think will happen to the places in these stories? The ones that still stand, the ones that might still hold whatever it is that held them when these people walked through? Write your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have more to share. We always do. That is all from me for tonight. Stay safe, stay curious, stay wonderful. And I will see you in the next one.